After moving to my new home, I met an extremely fat bear. The sun dipped below the pine-covered hills, painting the sky in hues of amber and gold. James Mitchell stood on the weathered porch of his newly purchased cabin, watching as shadows lengthened across the yard. At 67, the lines on his face had deepened, each one telling a story of joy or sorrow from his long life. Most recently, they told of loss, the kind that hollows out a person and leaves them drifting. "This will do," he murmured to himself, the words hanging in the crisp mountain air. No one was there to hear them anyway. 3 months ago, James had packed up the remnants of his life in Cincinnati, what little he wanted to keep after Margaret's passing, and headed south to the Blue Ridge Mountains of northern Georgia, their retirement plan now just his. The realtor had called it a rustic haven, which was a polite way of saying the place needed work. But James didn't mind, he needed the distraction. The cabin sat on 5 acres of land, mostly wooded, with a small clearing around the house. It was far enough from the nearest town, Piney Creek, to give him the solitude he craved, but close enough that he could drive in for supplies when needed. The neighbors were scattered, each property separated by enough forest to provide privacy but not so much that it felt completely isolated. He took a sip from his coffee mug, grimacing at the lukewarm liquid. The autumn evenings were getting cooler now, the warmth of summer giving way to the first whispers of winter. Soon, he'd need to start using the fireplace. Margaret would have loved it here, he thought. She'd always wanted a place in the mountains. A rustling from the tree-line caught his attention. James squinted, trying to make out shapes in the fading light, probably just a deer, he thought. He'd seen plenty of them since moving in, along with raccoons, possums, and the occasional fox. The wildlife was one of the selling points for him, nature going about its business, unconcerned with human troubles. But what emerged from the trees wasn't a deer. It was much larger, moving with a deliberate, lumbering gait. James's breath caught in his throat as the massive form of a brown bear came into view. He'd been warned about bears when he moved in. "Keep your trash secure and don't leave food out," the previous owner had advised. But he hadn't expected to see one so close to the house, especially not one this size. The bear was enormous, its body round and heavy, for a soft cinnamon brown in the evening light. James remained perfectly still, heart hammering in his chest. He knew enough about bears to know not to run, but his instinct screamed at him to get inside. The bear, however, didn't seem to be in any hurry. It ambled to the edge of his yard and then, oddly, sat down on its haunches and just looked at the house. For several long moments, man and bear regarded each other across the distance. There was something strangely calm about the animal's demeanor, no aggressive posturing, no foraging for food. It simply sat there, as if waiting for something. Then James noticed the collar around the bear's thick neck. It was a worn leather band, and hanging from it was what appeared to be a small bell. The sight was so incongruous that James almost laughed, a bear with a bell, like some oversized house cat. The bear eventually stood and shuffled back into the woods, leaving James bewildered on his porch. He remained there until full darkness fell, pondering the strange encounter. It was only later, as he was preparing for bed, that he realized the bear hadn't frightened him as much as it should have. Instead, there had been something almost companionable about its presence. The next morning, James drove into Piney Creek for groceries and decided to ask about the bear. The town was small, just a few thousand residents, with a main street that looked like it hadn't changed much since the 1950s. The grocery store doubled as a general store and unofficial community center where locals gathered to exchange news and gossip. "Oh, you met Big Bear," exclaimed Marge, the cheerful woman at the checkout counter, when James mentioned his visitor. Her gray hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and reading glasses hung from a chain around her neck. "He's harmless, don't you worry." "Big Bear?" James repeated, raising an eyebrow. "Well, that's what I call him. Others have different names. Chubby, quiet kid. He's been around these parts for years now. Never causes any trouble. Not like regular wild bears." A man stocking shelves nearby chimed in, "That's 'cause he ain't exactly wild. Used to be a circus bear, from what I heard. When the circus went belly up, he got loose somehow, but never really went back to being wild. Too used to people, I reckon." James frowned. "And no one's tried to?" "I don't know, call animal control or something." Marge laughed. "Oh, they came out once or twice, years ago. But they couldn't catch him. And after a while, folks just got used to him being around. He doesn't bother anyone. Just sits and waits sometimes, like he's expecting something." "Waiting," James murmured, remembering the bear's patient posture. It had reminded him of something, and now he realized what, himself, sitting outside the ICU during Margaret's final days, waiting for news that never got better. "You might want to talk to Betty Johnson," Marge suggested, bagging his groceries. "She lives down the road from you in that yellow house with the big kitten. She knows more about that bear than anyone. Been feeding him for years." James thanked her and left with his groceries and a name. He found himself strangely eager to learn more about his unusual neighbor. Betty Johnson turned out to be a spry octogenarian with a sharp mind and a sharper tongue. Her yellow house was indeed hard to miss, surrounded by an immaculate garden that somehow thrived despite the onset of autumn. She invited James in for tea when he knocked on her door, seeming unsurprised by his questions about the bear. "Cinnamon," she said firmly, pouring steaming tea into delicate cups that looked too fragile for her gnarled hands. "That's what I call him, for his color. None of this Big Bear nonsense. He deserves a proper name." James smiled, liking the name immediately. "Old Cinnamon," he said, testing the sound of it. It felt right, both for the bear's rich fur color and because it evoked a sense of warmth, like the spice itself. "Yes, that suits him." Betty nodded approvingly. "He's getting on in years now, just like us." She told James what she knew, that the bear had appeared in the area about 8 years ago. There had indeed been a small traveling circus that had been shut down for animal welfare violations, and rumors suggested the bear had escaped during the confusion. But instead of fleeing to the wilderness, he had lingered around the edges of human habitation. "That collar with the bell? That's from his circus days," Betty explained. "I tried to remove it once, but he wouldn't let me get close enough. I worry about it sometimes, whether it chafes or if the bell bothers him with its constant noise." James thought about the bear, Old Cinnamon, sitting alone in the woods with a bell forever announcing his presence, a remnant of his captive past. Something about that image tugged at his heart. "What does he eat?" James asked. "Whatever I give him," Betty chuckled. "Fruits, vegetables, fish sometimes. He's not picky. I leave it on my back porch, and he comes by every few days, regular as clockwork. And no one's worried about encouraging a wild animal to come near homes?" Betty gave him a look over the rim of her teacup. "He's not exactly wild anymore, is he? Too tame for the forest, too free for captivity. He's somewhere in between." like a lot of us end up. Her eyes, faded blue but still sharp, seemed to see right through James. Sometimes, creatures just need a little kindness to keep going. Bears, people, we're not so different in that regard. James left Betty's house with a lot to think about, and a container of homemade cookies for him and the bear. As he drove the winding road back to his cabin, he found himself scanning the tree-line, half hoping to catch a glimpse of cinnamon-brown fur. That evening, after putting away his groceries, James found himself walking to the edge of his yard with a bowl of mixed fruits, apples, pears, and berries. He placed it on a flat rock and then retreated to his porch to wait. He didn't have to wait long. As if the bear had been watching, perhaps he had been, Old Cinnamon emerged from the woods less than an hour later. He approached the bowl cautiously, sniffing the air before delicately picking out the berries with surprising dexterity for such massive paws. James watched, fascinated, as the bear ate. There was something almost dignified about the way Old Cinnamon carried himself despite his rotund figure. When the bowl was empty, the bear looked toward the porch where James sat. Their eyes met, and for a moment, James felt a strange connection. Two solitary beings finding unexpected company in each other. As days turned into weeks, leaving food for Old Cinnamon became part of James' routine. Every evening, he would place a bowl on the flat rock, and almost without fail, the bear would emerge to eat. Sometimes he came while James was still outside, and they would share the space in a companionable silence that grew more comfortable with each encounter. James began talking to the bear, at first feeling foolish but gradually finding comfort in voicing thoughts he had kept bottled up since Margaret's death. Old Cinnamon never responded, of course, but he seemed to listen, his small eyes fixed on James with what almost looked like understanding. Margaret would have loved you, James told him one evening as October gave way to November and the nights grew longer and colder. She always had a soft spot for strays and misfits. Brought home every injured bird and stray cat in the neighborhood when we were first married. The bear tilted his head slightly, the bell on his collar making a soft, muffled sound. James had noticed that the bell seemed to annoy Old Cinnamon. He would sometimes paw at it or shake his head as if trying to silence it. One crisp November morning, James woke early and decided it was time to do something about that bell. He had been thinking about it for days, planning carefully. He gathered some thick, soft cloth, scissors, and sturdy thread, then placed a special breakfast for Old Cinnamon on the rock. Honeycomb, which Betty had suggested as a rare treat that the bear couldn't resist. Sure enough, Old Cinnamon appeared quickly, drawn by the sweet smell. As he became engrossed in licking every drop of honey, James approached slowly, talking softly the entire time. The bear tensed but didn't flee, too focused on his treat to be overly concerned about James' proximity. With gentle movements, James wrapped the cloth around the bell, careful not to touch the collar itself. Old Cinnamon rumbled low in his chest but allowed the contact. Using the thread, James secured the cloth tightly around the bell, muffling its sound without removing it completely, a compromise that felt right. He didn't want to take away the collar, which might be the bear's only connection to his past life, but he could silence the constant reminder of captivity. "There you go, old boy," James murmured, stepping back. "No more announcing your every move to the world." Old Cinnamon finished his honeycomb, then shook himself, causing the now silent bell to swing harmlessly. He seemed to consider this development, then looked at James with what could only be described as gratitude before ambling back to the forest. That small act of kindness seemed to mark a turning point in their unusual relationship. Over the following weeks, Old Cinnamon began spending more time around James' cabin. He would watch from a distance as James split firewood or swept the porch, his presence a constant, comforting backdrop to James' days. Gradually, the bear ventured closer to the house. One afternoon, as James watered the few hardy plants that survived on his porch, he was startled to find old Cinnamon standing beside him, observing his actions with apparent interest. The bear then shuffled to the edge of the porch, where rainwater had collected in a natural depression, and began patting the water as if mimicking James' watering. James laughed out loud, his first genuine laugh in months. "Are you helping me garden, Cinnamon?" he asked, and the bear looked up at the sound of his name. These moments of connection multiplied as winter settled over the mountains. When James mopped his porch, old Cinnamon would drag a fallen branch nearby, sweeping it across the ground in a clumsy imitation. When James sat reading on his porch swing, the bear would settle at a respectful distance, watching quietly as if absorbing the peaceful scene. The most surprising moment came on a cold December evening. James had taken to playing his mandolin again, something he had abandoned after Margaret's death. The instrument had been hers originally. She had loved folk music and had taught James to play. He wasn't particularly skilled, but there was comfort in the familiar melodies. As he played an old Appalachian tune on the porch, wrapped in a thick blanket against the chill, he noticed movement at the edge of the yard. Old Cinnamon had emerged and was listening, his head slightly tilted. When James finished the song, the bear remained, waiting. So James played another and another, until his fingers grew stiff with cold. The next evening, as James played again, something extraordinary happened. Old Cinnamon approached the cabin and, to James' astonishment, carefully climbed the porch steps. He settled his massive bulk on the wooden planks with surprising gentleness and closed his eyes as the music washed over him. James' heart swelled with an emotion he couldn't quite name. He switched to a slow, sweet melody, the one he had played for Margaret in the hospital during her final days. Old Cinnamon seemed to sense the significance of the tune. He laid his head down on his paws, eyes still closed, listening with what appeared to be reverence. In that moment, something healed in James, a small piece of his grief transformed into something else, something warm and alive. He played until his fingers ached, and when he finally stopped, old Cinnamon opened his eyes and looked at him with such depth that James felt truly seen for the first time since Margaret's death. "Thank you for listening, old friend," James whispered, and the bear rumbled softly in response. As December deepened toward Christmas, James found himself preparing for the holiday for the first time since losing Margaret. He strung lights around the porch, partly for himself and partly because old Cinnamon seemed fascinated by them, staring at their twinkling glow for long periods. He even cut a small pine tree from his property and set it up in the front window where the bear could see it from outside. Old Cinnamon now spent most days near the cabin, returning to the forest only at night to sleep. James had begun to worry about the bear as the temperature dropped and snow dusted the mountains. Though old Cinnamon had a thick coat, James knew from Betty that the bear didn't hibernate properly anymore, another legacy of his circus life, where natural cycles had been disrupted. James found himself building what he called a bear shelter at the edge of his property, a three-sided structure with a roof, open at the front but protected from wind and snow, with a floor thickly layered with straw and old blankets. Old Cinnamon investigated it cautiously at first, but soon claimed it, spending increasingly cold nights curled up in its shelter rather than returning to the forest. The week before Christmas, a heavy snowstorm blanketed the mountains. Roads became impassable, and James found himself truly isolated for the first time since moving to Georgia. The power flickered and died on the second day of the storm, leaving him dependent on his fireplace for heat. Old Cinnamon disappeared the morning after the storm began. James watched anxiously from his windows as snow piled higher, wondering if the bear had sought better shelter deeper in the forest. By the third day, with no sign of his friend, James began to worry in earnest. On the fourth day, as James was carefully rationing his firewood, he heard a sound on his porch, a heavy shuffling followed by a soft whine. He opened the door to find Old Cinnamon standing there, one front paw held slightly off the ground, his fur matted with ice and mud. The bear looked exhausted, thinner than he had been days before, but his eyes brightened at the sight of James. "You came back," James breathed, relief washing over him. He stepped aside, holding the door open wider. "Come in, old boy, come in." It was a monumental moment, inviting a wild animal, or at least a once wild animal, into his home. But James didn't hesitate. Something told him this was right, that Old Cinnamon needed him now just as much as he had needed the bear's silent companionship these past months. Old Cinnamon seemed to understand the significance as well. He hesitated at the threshold, sniffing the air of the cabin before carefully, delicately stepping inside. His massive form seemed even larger in the confines of the cabin, but he moved with surprising care, as if aware of his size and potential to cause damage. James cleared a space near the fireplace, laying down several thick blankets to create a comfortable resting place. Old Cinnamon limped to it and sank down with a grateful rumble, extending his injured paw toward the warmth of the fire. Upon closer inspection, James could see the paw was scraped raw in places, likely from traversing rough terrain in the snow and ice. With gentle hands, he cleaned the wounds with warm water and applied an antibiotic ointment from his first aid kit. Old Cinnamon watched him work, occasionally huffing but never pulling away. "What happened to you out there?" James murmured, but of course, there was no answer. He imagined Old Cinnamon had gone looking for food in the storm, perhaps fallen on the icy ground or gotten caught in some natural trap in the forest. What mattered was that he had made his way back, had chosen to return to James rather than struggle alone. That night, man and bear slept by the fireplace, the storm howling outside but powerless to touch the warmth within. James dozed in his armchair while Old Cinnamon snored softly on his blanket nest, the silent bell on his collar catching occasional glints from the firelight. In the morning, the storm had passed, leaving a pristine white landscape outside the windows. Power remained out, but James had enough firewood to last another day or two. He prepared a breakfast of oatmeal for himself and offered Old Cinnamon a mix of dried fruits, nuts, and honey from his emergency supplies. As they ate their modest meal by the dying fire, James realized he needed to make a decision. Old Cinnamon's appearance on his doorstep hadn't been a temporary visit, it had been a homecoming. The bear had chosen him, chosen this place, and James couldn't imagine sending him back to the forest now. "I guess we're roommates now," he told the bear, who looked up from his breakfast with what James swore was a smile, though he knew bears couldn't actually smile. "We'll need to make some arrangements." Over the next few days, as power was restored and roads were cleared, James set about making his cabin suitable for its unusual new resident. He rearranged furniture to create wider pathways, removed fragile items from low shelves, and reinforced the porch to better support Old Cinnamon's weight. Most importantly, he designated a space in the corner of his fenced backyard as Old Cinnamon's outdoor room, a place where the bear could have privacy and attend to natural needs. James cleared away snow, laid down soft pine straw, and added a few large logs for the bear to climb or sit on. He built a sturdier, more permanent shelter there, but left the door to the house always accessible so Old Cinnamon could come and go as he pleased. News of James' unusual houseguest spread quickly through Piney Creek. Some neighbors were concerned, others amused, but most were simply curious. Betty Johnson was the first to visit, bringing a basket of bear-appropriate treats and a knowing smile. "I always thought he was waiting for someone special," she said, watching Old Cinnamon doze by the fire. "Turns out it was you." The local veterinarian, a young woman named Dr. Chen who specialized in large animals, offered to examine Old Cinnamon. To everyone's surprise, the bear allowed the examination with minimal fuss, especially after James sat beside him, a calming hand on his shoulder. "He's in remarkably good health for his age and background," Dr. Chen reported. "I'd estimate he's about 15 years old, which is getting up there for a bear, especially one with his history. The paw will heal clean. Just keep doing what you're doing. Good food, exercise, companionship. It's clearly working for him." She left James with vitamins to add to Old Cinnamon's food and her card for emergencies, though she admitted she had limited experience with bears specifically. "But then again," she added with a smile, "he's not exactly a typical bear, is he?" Winter settled into a comfortable routine. Mornings began with breakfast, coffee for James, fruit and nuts for Old Cinnamon. They would spend the day in companionable activities, James reading or working on small projects around the house, while Old Cinnamon explored the yard or napped in his favorite spots. In the evenings, James would play his mandolin, and the bear would listen, eyes half closed in contentment. Old Cinnamon proved to be surprisingly adaptable to indoor living. He was naturally clean, always using his outdoor area for bathroom needs, and was careful with his movements inside the house. He seemed to understand which objects were fragile and avoided them. He never showed aggression toward James or visitors, though he remained somewhat shy around strangers. James discovered that Old Cinnamon had a playful side too. The bear loved simple toys, a large rubber ball that he would nudge around the yard with his nose, feathers tied to a string that he would bat at with surprising delicacy, and most endearingly, a large plastic tub filled with water that he would splash in during warmer days. As winter eased toward spring, James received a phone call that changed everything once more. His daughter Emily was pregnant, his first grandchild was on the way. Emily lived in Seattle with her husband, Mark, and though they spoke regularly by phone, he hadn't seen her in person since Margaret's funeral. "That's wonderful news, sweetheart," James said, genuine joy filling his voice. Old Cinnamon, sensing his excitement, looked up from his nap by the window. "You're going to be a wonderful mother." "Thanks, Dad," Emily replied, and he could hear the smile in her voice. "Mark and I were thinking maybe you'd like to come out for a visit. Or we could come there. It's been too long." James hesitated, looking at Old Cinnamon. How could he explain his current living situation? "I'd love that," he said carefully, "but, well, there's something I should tell you about my life here. I've sort of adopted a roommate." "A roommate?" Emily sounded surprised. "Dad, that's great. I was worried about you being all alone out there." "It's not quite what you're thinking," James chuckled. "My roommate is a bear." The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that James thought they might have been disconnected. Finally, Emily spoke, her voice carefully controlled. "A bear? Like a real bear? Dad, are you feeling okay?" It took nearly half an hour and several photos texted to Emily's phone to convince her that yes, her father was living with an actual bear, and no, he hadn't lost his mind. By the end of the conversation, her shock had transformed into a mix of concern and fascination. "So I'm going to have a bear grandpa for my baby?" she asked, laughing in disbelief. At the sound of her laughter, so like Margaret's, old Cinnamon rolled onto his back, paws in the air, and let out a soft rumbling sound. James smiled, stroking the bear's exposed belly. "It looks like he approves of the idea." Emily and Mark planned a visit for early spring, when travel would be easier and before Emily's pregnancy advanced too far. James spent the weeks leading up to their arrival in a flurry of preparation, cleaning, repairing things he'd been putting off, and most importantly, helping old Cinnamon understand that new people would be coming. He showed the bear photos of Emily and Mark, talking about them constantly so old Cinnamon would associate their names and images with positive experiences. He even had Betty visit more frequently, along with Dr. Chan and a few other neighbors old Cinnamon had grown comfortable with, to help the bear practice being around more humans. The day of Emily and Mark's arrival dawned clear and mild, with the first wildflowers pushing through the forest floor and buds swelling on the trees. James had asked them to text when they reached Piney Creek so he could prepare old Cinnamon for their arrival. When the message came, James sat with the bear on the porch, one arm draped over his furry shoulder. "Remember what we talked about, old boy. Emily and Mark are family. They're important to me, just like you are." Old Cinnamon rumbled softly, leaning his weight against James in what had become their signal of understanding and affection. The rental car crunched up the gravel driveway, and James felt old Cinnamon tense beside him. He kept his hand firmly on the bear's shoulder, a reassuring presence, as the car doors opened and Emily and Mark stepped out, their expressions a mix of nervousness and wonder as they spotted the massive bear on the porch. "Dad," Emily called, staying by the car. She looked beautiful, James thought, her dark hair, Margaret's hair, pulled back in a ponytail, her pregnancy just beginning to show in the gentle curve of her belly. "It's okay, sweetheart," James called back, standing slowly. Old Cinnamon rose with him, still pressed against his side. "This is old Cinnamon. He's very gentle. Just move slowly and let him get used to you." The introduction went better than James could have hoped. Old Cinnamon remained calm, watching the newcomers with interest but no fear. Emily, after her initial shock wore off, approached with remarkable courage, speaking softly to the bear and eventually extending her hand for him to sniff. Mark followed her lead, his photographer's eye clearly itching to capture the incredible scene. By evening, the four of them had settled into a strange but harmonious tableau, James and Emily on the porch swing talking quietly, Mark taking photos of the surrounding forest, and old Cinnamon lying contentedly at their feet, occasionally accepting a gentle scratch behind the ears from his new friends. "I was so worried about you after Mom died," Emily admitted softly, watching the bear. "When you said you were moving out here all alone, I thought you were isolating yourself. Giving up." James followed her gaze to old Cinnamon. "I thought I was too," he said. "I came here looking for peace, for a quiet place to, I don't know, wait out whatever time I had left. I wasn't expecting to find a new purpose." "A bear wasn't on your retirement plan?" Emily teased gently. James laughed. "Definitely not. But he needed someone, and so did I. We found each other at the right time." Mark joined them, showing James the photos he'd taken, beautiful shots of old Cinnamon in the dappled forest light, and one particularly striking image of James and the bear silhouetted against the sunset. "This is incredible, James," Mark said. "I've never seen anything like it. The way he looks at you, there's real connection there." "I know," James said simply. "I can't explain it, but it's real." Emily and Mark stayed for a week, during which Old Cinnamon became increasingly comfortable with them. Emily even played the mandolin one evening. She had inherited her mother's musical talent, and the bear listened with the same rapt attention he gave to James' playing. On their last night, as they sat around a small fire in the backyard, Emily asked the question James had been anticipating. "What's your long-term plan, Dad? I mean, bears can live for decades in captivity, right? And what if something happens to you?" It was a fair question, one James had been considering himself. Old Cinnamon was estimated to be around 15, and captive bears could sometimes live into their 30s, though that was rare, given his circus background and unusual lifestyle. Chen thought 20 to 25 years was more realistic, still potentially longer than James might have left. "I've been talking with Dr. Chen and the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center over in Asheville," James explained. "We're working on legal paperwork to establish Old Cinnamon's status, sort of a protected semi-domestic animal, with provisions for his care if I can't provide it anymore." He hadn't wanted to think about it, but Emily was right to ask. "There's a trust being set up with funds for his care. Betty has agreed to be his secondary caretaker if needed, and the rehabilitation center would step in as a last resort. They have experience with bears that can't return to the wild." Emily nodded, relieved. "Good. That's good, Dad." She hesitated, then added, "You know we'd come back if anything happened. We'd make sure he was taken care of." James felt a lump in his throat. "I know you would, sweetheart." After Emily and Mark left, promising to return before the baby was born, James found himself reflecting on how much his life had changed in less than a year, from the emptiness following Margaret's death to this new, unexpected chapter. A home shared with an unlikely companion who had somehow filled the hollow spaces in his heart. The seasons turned, spring blossoming into summer. James and Old Cinnamon settled into their life together, each day bringing small joys and discoveries. The bear continued to surprise James with his intelligence and sensitivity, the way he would bring pine cones and interesting stones to the porch as if offering gifts. How he seemed to sense James' moods and respond accordingly, becoming playful when James was cheerful and quiet, offering silent companionship when melancholy descended. Emily's baby, a girl named Margaret Rose after her grandmother, was born in August. James flew to Seattle for 2 weeks, leaving Old Cinnamon in Betty's care. The separation was difficult for both of them. Betty reported that the bear spent hours each day sitting on the porch, watching the driveway. But the joy of meeting his granddaughter made the temporary parting worthwhile. When James returned, Old Cinnamon greeted him with such obvious relief and happiness that James found himself weeping, kneeling in the driveway with his arms around the bear's neck, murmuring reassurances that he would never leave for so long again. That night, as they sat on the porch watching fireflies rise from the summer grass, James showed Old Cinnamon photos of baby Margaret on his phone. The bear studied the images with unusual intensity, gently touching the screen with one claw, as if trying to connect with the tiny human who shared a name with James's beloved wife. "She'll visit when she's a bit older," James promised. "You'll be her bear grandpa, just like we said." Fall came again, marking a full year since James had moved to the cabin. On a particularly golden afternoon in early October, James took out his mandolin and began to play the special song, Margaret's song, that had become a sort of ritual between him and old Cinnamon. The bear, now fully recovered from his winter injury and gloriously healthy under James's care, settled beside him on the porch, his breathing deep and contented. When James finished the song, he set the mandolin aside and reached for a small wooden box he had placed nearby. "I've been meaning to do this for a while now," he said to old Cinnamon, who watched him with attentive eyes. James opened the box, revealing a velvet interior where he had placed the bell from old Cinnamon's collar. He had finally removed it completely a few months earlier with the bear's willing cooperation, replacing the worn leather with a new, more comfortable collar that Dr. Chen had provided. The bell rested in the box, polished now and silent. James had carved the box himself, a project that had taken weeks of careful work. On the lid were two names, Margaret and Cinnamon, and beneath them, the words, "Two Gifts of Love." "You both saved me," James said simply, his voice rough with emotion. "In different ways, at different times, but you both taught me how to love, how to heal, how to live." Old Cinnamon leaned against him, warm and solid, his soft breathing synchronized with James's own. The bear placed one massive paw gently on James's knee, a gesture he had learned meant affection and understanding. In the warm golden light of the autumn afternoon, with the mountains painted in shades of amber and rust, James stroked old Cinnamon's soft fur and whispered the words that had been growing in his heart since that snowy day when the bear had chosen to return to him. "Thank you for choosing to come back. Thank you for teaching me how to love again." Old Cinnamon rumbled softly in response, his eyes half closed in contentment. Above them, a hawk circled in the clear blue sky, free and wild, while below, in a cabin nestled among the pines, man and bear had found a different kind of freedom, the liberty that comes from unexpected connection, from finding family in the most unlikely places, from learning that love, in all its forms, is the truest wilderness of all.